The November fog over Cedar Hollow Lake hung so low and so thick that the far bank disappeared into white haze barely 200 yards out. Here, in the northwest corner of Montana, autumn didn't arrive gradually. It fell all at once, like an old ceiling that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Yesterday, it had been 48 degrees. This morning, Henry Cole woke to the pipes groaning and the porch thermometer reading 25. He was 61 years old. He used to tell himself that wasn't much. But this past year, he'd stopped counting. After they buried Margaret in the spring, the days had started to feel like pages in a book with no text. The shape was there, the size was there, but nothing inside. Henry sat on the old bench at the end of the wooden dock and watched the fog eat the water. His fishing rods lay beside him, still rolled up. He didn't come here so much to fish as simply to be somewhere that asked nothing of him. The lake didn't wonder why he was quiet. The pines along the shore didn't seem surprised he'd come alone. The fog closed off the whole surrounding world and left only a small circle of silence where he could simply exist without pretending to be anything at all. He picked up his thermos, unscrewed the lid, smelled the coffee. It had gone cold. It didn't matter. That was when the sound reached him from behind the reed-covered point. At first, Henry thought it was a heron. The bird sometimes let out a cry like that in the fog, as if complaining about its own loneliness. But the sound came again, and this time there was something different in it. Not a bird sound, something alive, but muffled, as if through cloth. He stood. The dock creaked quietly under his boots. Henry walked to the edge where the reeds already touched the planking and stopped, staring into the white. Right at the water's edge, where the mud gave way to dry grass, lay a large canvas bag, dark green, tied with rope in several places. It was perfectly still. But that very stillness struck Henry as wrong. Things only lie that still when they are trying not to move. He stepped off the dock and into the cold grass, walked closer, and then the bag flinched, just a little, barely enough to see. But Henry saw it. He dropped to one knee, not thinking about the wet, and started working at the knots. His fingers didn't cooperate. The rope was soaked and cinched so tight it seemed like whoever tied it had wanted it to stay tied forever. He pulled the knife from his pocket, the old folding knife he'd carried since the army, and simply cut through. The canvas fell open. Inside lay a puppy, a German shepherd, very small, no more than 4 weeks old, wet, half-frozen, eyes shut. It was barely breathing. Henry only noticed because he stared long enough and finally caught the faint movement in its side. He didn't think. He just picked it up, tucked it inside his jacket against his body, and walked quickly back to the truck. His pickup was parked on the shoulder of the dirt road, 200 yards from the water. Henry got in behind the wheel, still holding the puppy inside his jacket, and turned the heat up to full blast. The small body didn't move. He carefully took it out, laid it on the passenger seat, covered it with his scarf. "Not here," he said quietly. He wasn't sure who he was saying it to. All the way home, he kept glancing at the scarf-wrapped bundle on the seat beside him. Once he caught a faint movement and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not joy exactly, something sharper, something that catches in your throat. When he carried the puppy inside, the first thing he did was lay it in a box lined with towels and set a heating pad wrapped in another towel alongside it so it wouldn't burn. Then he went to the kitchen. Milk. He needed to warm some milk, but you couldn't give puppies regular cow's milk. He'd known that once, but couldn't remember why. He called the vet. Susan Barkley, who worked out of Pinewood, 20 miles up the road. "Henry?" She sounded surprised. "Have you ever called me at 7 in the morning before?" "Never," he said, "but I've got a problem." Susan told him to come right away. While he got ready, he kept checking the box. The puppy was breathing, a little more evenly now, but still very faintly. At the clinic, Susan took the little one immediately, examined it, started an IV. Dehydration, hypothermia, she said, but the heart is beating. If it makes it through the next 12 hours, it'll live. Who did this? She asked. And in her voice, Henry heard the same thing he was feeling himself, a cold, compressed anger. I don't know, he said. Found it in a bag by the lake. She shook her head and didn't ask anything more. Henry sat in the clinic until noon, then drove home, made some eggs, ate them without tasting them, washed the plate, and sat down in the armchair. The house was quiet. But the quiet had changed somehow. Not hollow the way it usually was, but waiting, as if the house itself was holding its breath to see how things would turn out. 3 days later, Susan called. Henry, you can come get him. He's alive and apparently furious at the world. For a German shepherd, that's completely normal. He named him Rex for no particular reason. It was just that when the little dog opened his eyes for the first time and looked up at him, dark brown eyes, serious, with that expression you see in very old people or very young dogs, Henry said the word out loud, Rex, and the dog seemed to agree. The first weeks were hard. The puppy needed feeding every few hours with a special formula Susan had prescribed and shown him how to prepare. Henry got up in the night, warmed the formula, fed it from a small bottle. He didn't sleep properly once in 3 weeks, but for the first time in many months, he had a reason to get up in the morning. Rex grew fast. Shepherds do. As if someone pushed an accelerate button. At first he wobbled on his legs and went down when he misjudged a turn. Then he started running through the house with great seriousness, as if carrying out a mission of considerable importance. Then he discovered the yard and found that the world was much larger than he'd thought, a realization that clearly unsettled him. He followed Henry everywhere, not because he'd been taught to, simply because he'd decided to. If Henry went to the kitchen, Rex went with him. If Henry sat down to read, Rex lay at his feet. At night, he slept beside the bed. Not on it, Henry hadn't allowed that, but always pressed against the side of the mattress, close enough to feel the person nearby. There were things Rex did on his own that Henry had never taught him. When an unfamiliar car pulled into the driveway, for instance, Rex would go out onto the porch and stand there without moving, watching, until the stranger got out and showed who he was and why he'd come. He didn't growl or bark without cause. He just stood and looked. That was usually enough. And then there was this. One night, Henry woke to Rex whimpering softly at the bedroom door. He got up, went out, and saw that the damper on the wood stove had been left open and the smell of smoke was drifting through the kitchen. Nothing serious had happened yet, but it could have. He closed the damper, checked everything, and went back to bed. Rex lay down in his spot and didn't stir again. Henry lay in the dark for a long time, thinking about that. The next morning he bought the dog a bone, a large one, substantial, clearly excessive for the occasion. Rex accepted it with dignity and carried it somewhere into the yard with the bearing of someone who knows his own worth. The neighbors started to notice. "You look different, Henry," Dolores Hutchins said one day at the mailboxes. She'd been a widow for 10 years already, and maybe that was why she watched people more carefully than those who still had someone at home. Better. Henry had meant to say something neutral, but instead said the truth. "I guess it's because I have a reason to wake up." Dolores nodded, as if he'd said something very wise. Rex grew up, and with him, the nature of what they had together changed. No longer simply a puppy and the person looking after him. Something more complicated, and probably more accurate, two survivors of something hard walking alongside each other. Henry started going back to the lake, but now he didn't just sit on the dock in silence. He walked the forest trails around it, and Rex went ahead, constantly looking back, checking, as if saying, You still there? Good. Let's keep going. December that year was harsh, even by Montana standards. The first snow fell in mid-November and never left. By December 1st, Cedar Hollow Lake was frozen over, thin and transparent at first, then thicker, white. Henry went out on the porch every morning and looked at the thermometer. 5 below, -4. One morning, -9. Rex was not afraid of snow. He treated it, in fact, as though it were the best thing nature had ever come up with. He leaped into drifts, dug holes with his nose, tore around the yard, leaving a trail of tangled tracks that, viewed from above, would have resembled the diagram of some elaborate military maneuver. Henry watched him and smiled for the first time in a year. Not politely, not out of obligation. Just because. In mid-December, his neighbor Bill Torrance came by. Bill lived 3 miles down the road, had hunted and fished his whole life, knew every lake and trail in the county better than his own backyard. He came bearing fishing news. The ice on Cedar Hollow was thick enough. Other people were already out. The fish were biting well. "Going tomorrow," Bill said. "You coming?" Henry thought about it. He hadn't ice fished in a long time. The last few years he'd gone with Margaret. She'd sat beside him in her warm coveralls, reading while he watched the hole, and somehow that had been enough for both of them. Then, everything stopped. "I'll go," he said, "but Rex comes with me." Bill looked at the dog, who was sitting nearby, with the expression of someone who had already decided everything for everyone. "Of course," Bill said. They went out early, when the sky hadn't yet decided what color to be. The cold pulled the air into something dense and almost visible. Every breath came out as its own small cloud. Henry walked behind Bill. Rex went ahead, nosing through the drifts, checking every track, every hollow. Once he stopped, sniffed at something under the snow, and looked back at Henry with the expression of a person who has found something important but cannot explain what. "Come on, Rex," Henry said. They stepped out onto the ice. The lake looked endless, a wide white expanse framed on all sides by dark pines. Here and there frozen reeds stood up through the surface. The silence was so complete, it seemed like if you shouted, the echo would come back from all directions at once. Bill stopped 200 yards from shore and began drilling a hole. Henry stopped too, but a bit farther out. He liked to fish where there was no one nearby, even a friend. An old habit. Rex stayed close at first, then began making wide loops around them, the way he always did when he was checking a place over. Henry watched him out of the corner of his eye, setting up the auger. He took a few steps to the side, looking for a spot without cracks. The crack came from under his foot with no warning. Not a sound, a sensation. Like when the floor simply stops existing. Henry had only time to understand that he was falling, and then the ice-cold water closed over his head. It was so cold that for a moment he forgot how to breathe. He went down, his heavy clothes pulling, his boots pulling, his pack pulling. Then instinct pushed him up, and he clawed to the surface. He grabbed at the edge of the hole, but the ice crumbled in his hands, thin there where he'd just been standing. Too thin. "Bill!" he shouted. But Bill was far off and, with the wind blowing the other way, probably couldn't hear. Henry tried again, held on, tried to pull himself up, but the clothes weighed like stone and every attempt broke the edge a little more. He felt the cold moving through everything. Through skin, through muscle, down into the bones. Rex appeared suddenly. He ran to the edge of the hole and stopped a yard back, far enough that he wouldn't go through himself, and started barking. Loud, continuous, his paws scraping at the ice. "Rex," Henry said, and his voice came out strange, already a little slow from the cold. "Rex, go. Go get someone." The dog kept barking. He didn't understand. "Rex!" Henry looked him in the eyes. "Go. Go to Bill. 1 second. 2. The dog looked at him with an expression Henry couldn't read. Not fear, not confusion, something between them and above them. And then Rex wheeled around and ran. He ran the way you run when there is no choice. His body moved low and level over the snow, his paws throwing up white behind him. He swung wide around a dark patch where the ice looked wrong and hit firmer ground. Every few seconds he threw a glance back, not slowing, just checking his bearings, and ran on. Bill Torrance heard him in 20 seconds. He thought at first, just the dog running around. But there was something wrong with the sound of the barking, not happy, not playful. Heavy, urgent, with pauses, as if each bark cost something and the dog was paying anyway. He looked up from the hole. Rex was coming straight for him. He braked hard at 10 yards, spun around, took a few steps back the way he'd come, stopped, barked again, looked at Bill, then back, then at Bill again. "Where's Henry?" Bill said out loud, even though the dog couldn't answer. But Rex, as if he'd understood, took several more steps in the direction he'd come from and turned back. Bill dropped the auger and ran. Rex ran ahead, looking back constantly, waiting when the man fell behind. Once he stopped at a dark patch on the ice and went around it, and Bill went around it too. As if the dog knew where you could step and where you couldn't. They saw Henry from a distance. He was still holding on to the edge of the hole, but his movements had slowed, and Bill understood that right away. He had rescue gear with him, a rope and a metal spike he always brought ice fishing, though he'd never thought he'd need them. "Hold on," he shouted. He lay down on the ice to spread his weight, threw the rope. Henry caught it. His fingers barely worked, but he caught it. Bill pulled. Rex stood nearby without a sound, as if he understood that his job right now was simply to be there and not be in the way. Henry didn't remember getting onto the ice, didn't remember standing up. He remembered only Bill's hands pulling him, and how very hard it had become to think, not from pain, but from the cold that had taken hold of his thoughts and was slowly dissolving them. Bill pulled his own jacket off and put it around Henry. "Can you walk?" "Yes," Henry said, but his legs weren't cooperating well. They moved toward shore. Rex walked beside Henry, close, pressing against his leg with every step, as if holding him up, as if saying, "I'm here, we're going." Bill's SUV was parked by the shore, an old Ford, warm inside. They loaded Henry into the back seat. Rex jumped in after him and lay down next to him. Bill called for an ambulance and drove hard toward Pinewood. In the truck, Henry felt the warmth beginning to come back, not all at once. First, just the burning in his hands and feet, painful and good at the same time. He looked out the window at the passing pines and thought about nothing in particular. He just existed. Rex laid his head on Henry's lap. Henry put his hand on him. The dog didn't move, just breathed quietly. Henry spent 2 days at Pinewood Regional Hospital. Nothing critical. Hypothermia, observation, an IV, warmth. Dr. Rebecca Ford, a short woman with gray hair and the expression of someone who has seen everything already, examined him, nodded slowly, and said, "You were lucky, Henry." "I know," he said. "Lucky someone went for help." "Yes," Henry said. "Lucky." He didn't say who had gone. Rebecca didn't ask. The next day, Dolores Hutchins came to visit. She brought a homemade apple pie, sat down by the bed, and said nothing for a while, just looked out the window. Then she said, "Margaret would have said you always went too far. In everything." Henry laughed. He hadn't expected the sound from himself. Dry, a little surprised. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." Dolores nodded and cut the pie. The second day, he asked Bill to bring his phone from the house and called Susan Barkley. "Rex is with him. He's fine," she said immediately, as if she'd known why he was calling. "Is he eating?" "Barely, but he's drinking water and watching the street." Henry put the phone down and lay for a while, staring at the ceiling. Then he told the nurse who came to check the IV, "I need to get home. Someone's waiting for me." The nurse looked at him with that particular expression people have when they see recovery not in test results, but in a person's eyes, and went to work something out with Dr. Ford. The next morning, they discharged him. Rex had been staying with Bill those 2 days. Bill said afterward that the dog had barely eaten and had spent the whole time lying by the door, looking out at the street. When Henry got out of the car and came home, Rex broke out of Bill's yard the moment the gate opened and ran straight across the road to him. He stopped right in front of Henry, sniffed his hand, then let out a soft sound, not a bark, more of a slow exhale, a single breath, as if he'd said something for which there is no word in human language. Henry bent down and held him. The dog stood still and let him. Winter passed. Montana spring arrived, cautiously at first, then with conviction, then in a rush, the way it happens in the north where nature seems to be trying to make up for lost time. The snow was gone in a week. The lake opened up. The pines stood brown for a while, and then all went green at once. Henry kept going to the lake, but now he brought 2 cups, one for himself, one empty, which he set beside him and looked at for a time. That was his conversation with Margaret. He hadn't stopped the habit, but it had changed, no longer hollow and heavy the way it once was, but simply quiet. Rex sat beside him and waited. One morning in May, Henry sat on the old bench and thought about how exactly 1 year ago he'd found a canvas bag in this very spot. Rex lay at his feet with his chin on his paws, watching the water with the expression of serious contemplation that belongs to a particular type of person. Those who don't rush in with questions, but notice everything. Henry looked at him. Rex raised his head and looked back. They sat that way for a minute, maybe longer. "Good that you're here," Henry said. The dog thumped his tail against the ground once, twice, then laid his head back down on his paws and went on watching the water. The lake shimmered in the spring sun. Somewhere in the pines, a woodpecker was calling. The wind brought the smell of mud and pine resin, a smell Henry had known all his life and which now somehow smelled different. Not worse and not better. Just different. As if something in him had opened up again, something he'd long stopped noticing. Or come back. It was hard to say which word was more accurate. But he was sitting on his bench by Cedar Hollow Lake, Montana, and he was in no hurry to be anywhere. Beside him sat a dog with dark, serious eyes. And in the house behind the pines, it wasn't empty. That was enough. That was more than enough.